Starting off at number 5, Kolat. Kolat is a Polish horror game released in 2015 and is the most directly inspired by real events of any of the games on this list, putting you in the shoes of an explorer setting out to uncover the truth and close the case on the Dilatov Pass incident, a mystery that's plagued and terrified people for 60 years. 9 Russian college students disappeared under incredibly mysterious circumstances in the winter while trekking out in the mountains. This is of course based on the real-life Dilatov Pass incident where this exact thing happened. A group of friends went out for a trek in the mountains, and after no word was heard from the group for nearly a month, a search party set out, and after months and months of searching the mountains, eventually police found the remains of the hikers. 6 had passed from hypothermia, and 3 of them had horrific internal injuries. It's a very famous case, and I invite you to read about it after this video because it is fascinating and terrifying, and no one had gotten to the bottom of it, so it seemed like a good setting for a survival horror mystery game that's also narrated by Sean Bean for some reason. Yeah, Sean Bean narrates this one. I don't know why, but because he's the narrator, he can't die, so he's got that going for him. While the most common hypothesis is that the group suffered under an avalanche, the game offers a much more complex narrative than that, featuring a bit of government conspiracy, supernatural dealings, and all the usual checklist stuff you'd expect from an indie Steam horror game. I've never actually played it, so I can't comment on it too much. I did watch the trailer, looks pretty cool, but I like to throw in one indie game in these lists that nobody's ever heard of. Check Kolat out, go give it a shot. And if you're enjoying all the content we're putting out, first of all, thank you very much. But might I suggest subscribing or clicking through for loads more horror content? We got loads of videos and we love the clicks. Let's keep going. Number 4, Outlast. Nothing is scarier than being alone in a dark hospital at night. And it's made even worse when all the patients are deranged and violent from years of government-sanctioned brainwashing. That's Outlast. If you haven't played Outlast, you play as an intrepid journalist who goes off to investigate an asylum after an anonymous whistleblower sends you a tip to go check it all out because something freaky is happening up there. So you do, and in classic horror video game guy fashion, you only bring a camera with you and nothing else, and don't even tell anyone you're going. You barely even bring batteries. You discover that the asylum has gone downhill, to say the least, and the inmates are running the asylum and are all too far gone to even know what's happening anymore, and are all violently hostile to outsiders. We learn as we venture through the halls that all the inmates have been experimented on by a cruel corporation trying to research the usual super soldier stuff, using all sorts of immoral research to try and activate extrasensory powers on people. Now, of course, Outlast does get pretty fantastical and horrifying, and I don't want to spoil too much, but eventually you are, like, running away from ghosts and psychic conscious monsters, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist. But the horrors of Outlast, the really scary stuff, isn't the bloody patients or monsters, it's the fact that they were experimented on by questionable government scientists for the ridiculous purpose of creating psychic super soldiers. Which would sound like a video game plot if it wasn't for the CIA's MK-Ultra, Montauk, and Project Gateway programs, which are all very real, very documented instances when the CIA tried to research how possible it was to make someone psychic. Look this up when this video is done, okay? The infamous projects have served as the inspiration for a few things, with Montauk and MK-Ultra directly inspiring the Netflix series Stranger Things. Sometimes the strangest things are the things that really happen. But the strangest thing about Outlast? Why does your guy never try to fight back, even once? He only has the camera, I get that, but he's not even gonna try picking up a pipe or something. He's got feet, he's got hands, I don't know, I'm still bothered about this, we gotta move on. Number 3. Agony. Agony, 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 agony. I was working at a video game store when this one came out, and boy do I remember the controversy around it. Our store only got a single copy of the game. Agony was a 2018 survival horror game that set out on a mission to be the most disgusting game ever released, and in a lot of ways, they achieved that. Agony follows the story of a lost soul condemned to hell with no memory of their former life, and like anyone who'd be trapped in hell, are trying fruitlessly to escape. Agony's main selling point was its intense depiction of hell, overflowing with blood, gore, fire, and brimstone. Agony is pretty much non-stop gooey gore from the second the game starts. The game was actually heavily censored before even being released, as initial ratings of Agony received the infamous adults only rating, which would have prevented it from being sold in major retailers or online platforms. So the final product had to be heavily edited just to even meet the M17 rating, the highest rating the ESRB gives out. I feel like it's worth throwing this out there if you're hearing about this and you think that I made Agony sound kinda cool and you want to check the game out. I'll let you know that the controversy seems like it was more a marketing thing because the actual game is kind of bad. For all its overwhelming gore, it gets really dull fast. You know, you walk into one room full of nightmarish, incomprehensible walls of 1,000 wretched faces screaming and crying blood, and Really, you've seen them all, you know? The game gets pretty samey really fast, and the actual gameplay is really dull despite its environments. After its release, it became clear that Agony was nothing more than a maypole for controversy. Number 2. Condemned: Criminal Origins. Condemned: Criminal Origins was a launch title for the Xbox 360 all the way back in 2005. So I wouldn't be surprised if you forgot about it. It was a first-person survival horror game where you played a detective built like a linebacker, hunting a serial murderer on the trail of a series of condemned buildings, obviously, all the while being attacked by populations of the city who have all gone violently mad by some mysterious force. Now, Condemned is probably the scariest game on this list, and I'd go so far as to say it's one of the scariest games I've ever played in my life. Drawing major inspiration from films like Seven, Silence of the Lambs, and Saw, Condemned is the kind of game that makes you feel like you need to take a boiling shower afterwards and scrub yourself. The game is entirely in a first-person perspective, and you really feel like you are knee-deep in the filthy grime of the city. So what banned Condemned? Well, in Germany, the game was refused to be sold because of a law stating that any depictions of cruel or otherwise inhuman acts of violence against human beings in a manner which expresses a glorification, which really could describe any of the video games I listed today. Interestingly, unlike a lot of the other ones on this list, Condemned was actually banned after it was released, not before. Its sequel, Condemned Bloodshot, was also banned for the exact same reasons. Now, for what it's worth, Condemned is pretty vile and pretty scary. It's a testament to how disturbing the game is in its depictions of horror, foregoing supernatural elements and trying to depict the situation as realistically as possible. You do have to admit, it is kind of ironic too that when you think about it, the game itself was condemned. Still, nonetheless, if you're feeling brave and up for it, I would recommend checking it out. It is horrifying. Number 1. Manhunt. There could not have been any other game at number 1 on the list about banned horror video games. If you're passionate about horror games and you know your horror game history, you were probably already expecting for Manhunt to show up. When you really think about it, Manhunt is probably one of the most infamous video games ever released. Manhunt comes to us from Rockstar Games, who are definitely no stranger to controversy, being the developers behind Grand Theft Auto. If anything, they welcome controversy, even going so far as in the early days paying for bad reviews for the GTA games to make them seem cooler. A contraband video game? What kid wouldn't want that? Well, Manhunt was a similar situation. Almost all of Rockstar's games see you playing a criminal of some kind, be it a thug, an outlaw, or a high school bully. But Manhunt has you playing as a death row inmate who is kidnapped by a sick benefactor known as the Director, who communicates to you through an earpiece, and in exchange for your freedom, wants to watch you take out members of various gangs across the city while he watches you on hijacked CCTV cameras for his sick pleasure. As the player fights off depraved gangsters, criminals, and one particularly memorable delusional chainsaw-wielding naked pig mask-wearing psychopath, you'll find yourself caught in a grisly web. Now, video game violence has always been a very touchy subject. What is too realistic? Where is the line? Manhunt very intentionally walked that line. A quote from ex-Rockstar developer Jeff Williams, who contributed to Manhunt, had this to say: "The game just made us all feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was about realistic violence. We all knew there was no way we could explain away this game. We all knew we were crossing a line. There was almost a mutiny in the staff over it." A Manhunt sees the player executing people for the pleasure of the Director, all using household objects and disturbingly realistic depictions of violence. Infamously, Manhunt was involved in a real-life tragic death, with the assailant having been purported to have been obsessed with the game by friends, which led to efforts to have the game banned outright from stores. In New Zealand, owning Manhunt was actually considered a criminal charge. You could get charged for having this video game in your home. The province of Ontario restricted Manhunt to the dreaded AO rating, pulling it from store shelves. Despite the intense nature of the game and the controversy surrounding it, Manhunt went on to be a cult classic. It sold well, it wasn't banned as widespread as Rockstar had feared, and to this day, it still even has its fans. It sold and reviewed well enough to even get a sequel, which very bizarrely was exclusive to the Nintendo Wii, a console exclusively known for its family-friendly entertainment. Nothing more family-friendly than Manhunt. Number 5. Left 4 Dead 2. Up first on our list is Left 4 Dead 2, the sequel to Valve's 2008 smash hit Left 4 Dead. Left 4 Dead 2 changed the game entirely, revolutionizing the zombie genre and reinventing everything you knew about Left 4 Dead by taking the exact same game and setting it in Louisiana instead of Pennsylvania. Now, the actual game is amazing. I could hark sweet nothings about Left 4 Dead all day. The 4-player co-op zombie survival game was some of the most fun you could have with an internet connection back in the day. I probably lost hundreds of hours of my 8th grade playing Left 4 Dead 2. But if you happen to live somewhere like Australia or Germany, you wouldn't been able to have played Left 4 Dead 2 at all, since because of its intense depictions of violence, the game was deemed too heinously gory to be sold, classifying it as too violent to be sold as an MA-15 game, the highest rating Australia had at the time. Valve tried to fight back against the classification as much as they could, insisting that all the violence depicted in the game was against zombies, who are no longer human. They just look like humans and fall apart pretty easily. The workaround? Valve released a heavily censored release of Left 4 Dead 2 for international markets, which removes just about everything yucky. No missing limbs, no guts, gore, blood, and piles of bodies are all gone out of the Australian release. Oddly, and possibly as an apology for removing content, the German release of Left 4 Dead 2 also heavily censored all the violence, features weaponry not available in any other releases of the game, all ported over from Counter-Strike's source. Pretty funny to note as well, the cover art for Left 4 Dead 2 is a severed hand missing a couple fingers, with 2 fingers held up to denote that it's Left 4 Dead 2, like this. Well, because that gesture is considered rude in England, the cover was replaced there with a variant where the hand is facing backwards. And hey, on the off chance anybody from Valve's watching, if you guys wouldn't mind, I really would like another Left 4 Dead. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror content coming your way every day. Number 4. Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill has always been one of the most terrifying video game series on the planet. When you think of the hulking pyramid head or any of the other flesh monstrosities that wander the restless dreams of that town, Silent Hill has always been good at making your hair stand on end. Silent Hill Homecoming was the 5th Silent Hill released, and the first by a studio that wasn't Team Silent. The player is put into the boots of Alex Shepard, a Spec Ops combat veteran returning to his hometown, not of Silent Hill, but its neighboring town of Shepherd's Glen. It's a homecoming, if you will. Now the actual game is okay. I'm too close to Silent Hill to speak about the series fairly. I wouldn't say it's the scariest Silent Hill, and it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. It's kind of just right in the middle. But it's the only game in the series that was ever outright banned. The game contains some pretty intense violence, probably the goriest entry in the series, I would say. A scene in particular depicts our hero Alex struggling against a cultist enemy, and if Alex fails the event, Alex gets a drill into him violently, and if he succeeds, the cultist gets the drill, so either way, somebody is losing bad. And that someone is the nations of Australia, Germany, and Japan, as the game was refused classification for Australia and Germany, and speaking of which, those two are going to come up a lot on this list, as they really do not like violence in their games. Japan is a little more confusing, as I couldn't find why the game was never sold in Japan. Violence doesn't usually tend to get a game banned in Japan, so it's unknown why it was never available there. But to our Japanese viewers, I gotta say, you're really not missing out on too much. Don't worry.
Next up at number 3, Hatred. If we're talking pure disturbing content, then Hatred is pretty high up on this list. Developed and published as the debut release for Destructive Creations, a studio based in Poland, Hatred introduces the player as a misanthropic, mass-killing sociopath on a genocide crusade to kill as many human beings as possible. To say this game was controversial is a little bit of an understatement. The developers describe Hatred as a reaction to video game aesthetic trends, political correctness, lightness, vivid colour, and games as art. Which, in a way, I'm all for. You can't have light without some dark, but these guys just totally missed the mark. The sake of being disturbing and shocking for the sake of being disturbing and shocking doesn't really give you the precedence to create offensive material without the outline of some kind of wider message, which this game doesn't have. It's just continuous violent murder wrapped up in a crappy game. Its soundtrack is pretty decent though. I'll give them that. Coming in at number 2, Sad Satan. Now this game is a little bit of an enigma and pretty damn creepy nonetheless. First picked up on the YouTube channel Obscure Horror Corner in June 2015, it was initially thought to be a promotional stunt of the channel's popularity, which undeniably worked, but then things got a little bit real. Built on the Terror engine and developed by an unknown source, Sad Satan was reportedly downloaded to the internet through the Tor network via a deep web internet forum. It was referred to by a forum user known only as ZK, and then later released to 4chan by someone claiming to be the same user, claiming that people needed to witness the true version of the game. What exactly does it contain then? Well, not a whole lot of anything other than gore and other disturbing images from the dark places of the internet. The player walks down a monochromatic corridor as audio recordings of various murderers such as Charles Manson and Tsutomu Miyazaki are played. Real images of murder and beheadings pop up and creepy child statues follow the player's movement. It's bizarre, it's weird, and if someone did create it as a release to the deep web, and it's even weirder. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Manhunt 2. This list wouldn't be complete without the most controversially banned game in history. A sequel to Manhunt, which I've actually played and is a pretty bleak game, Manhunt 2 was released in 2007 by Rockstar Games. The game actually has a pretty great storyline, but it's the execution of its content that got the public all riled up. You play as Daniel Lamb, a patient at Dixmoor Asylum who wakes up with amnesia, who is accompanied by Leo Casper, a sociopathic assassin who guides Daniel on his journey. Reception of the game was mixed, to say the least. In the UK, it caused outrage as the first Manhunt had been inaccurately connected to a murder case in 2004, and certain politicians were enraged at the thought of a sequel. As US Senator at the time, Hillary Clinton, amongst others, described the game as visceral and casually sadistic, and it was outright refused to be given a rating by the BBFC. So, kicking off at number 5, we have Postal 2. Released in 2003 as the synonymous sequel to 1997's original Postal, this game labels itself as a black comedy first-person shooter video game from creators running with scissors. Now, in all fairness, the reason this game is at number 5 is because I'm personally unsure whether it deserves such backlash. Yeah, it's bad, it's in poor taste, but the game's creators clearly marketed it as a niche game, with the tagline, "It's only as violent as you are." Nevertheless though, in 2004, New Zealand banned the game due to its gross and abhorrent content, with Australia soon joining suit, banning it due to excessive abhorrent content. They like that word. It went on to be banned in Malaysia, Germany and Sweden, although some of them would be later rescinded. In the game, you play the role of the postal dude, an everyday run-of-the-mill trailer park denizen who has to complete a certain number of tasks as peacefully or violently chaotic as the player chooses to. Religious cults, cannibalistic butchers, Al-Qaeda, Gary Coleman, it's got it all. Coming in at number 4, Standoff. Yeah. This game just sucks. Standoff, previously titled Active Shooter, was developed by Russian video game creator Anton Maryevsky and publisher Peter Berudyev. In my opinion, it's a game in incredibly poor taste, lack of foresight, and just a straight up terrible title. The game depicts a school shooting where the player takes the role of either an active shooter or a SWAT member responding to the event. Players have an arsenal of guns, grenades, or knives, and a civilian police death tally that racks up on screen. The game attracted some serious controversy in May of 2018 after parents of the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting victims campaigned against the game online, a petition which attracted over 100,000 signatures by the time of the game's cancellation through Steam. Valve, the company behind Steam, later went on to update its publishing policy and called the game's creator a troll with a history of customer abuse, publishing copyrighted material, and user review manipulation. Nice work there, bud.
Number 3, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. Well, given the title of the game, I bet if you really think about it, you can probably imagine what true event Stalker is based on. But if you're not a fan of GSC's ultra brutal apocalypse RPG horror series, Stalker, which is an acronym for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventurers, and I honestly can't remember the rest. Anyway, you play a stalker, someone who traverses the hostile irradiated hellscape known as the Zone, the surrounding areas around Chernobyl, which have become host to all sorts of threats from zombies, mutants, bandits, and radiation. It paints a pretty grim scenario. In the world of Stalker, the Chernobyl incident occurred the same way it did in our real world. Mismanagement and improperly constructed equipment led to a disastrous accident that irradiated the surrounding area, causing everyone to evacuate and causing a state of emergency. Where the timelines differ is that in Stalker, after this accident, some secret Soviet scientists go back to Chernobyl to use it as a lab to conduct all sorts of nefarious experiments that eventually lead to a collapse in reality, tearing open some holes, anomalies everywhere, and even bigger disaster, letting loose all manner of monster and mutant under the surrounding areas, such as life in the Zone. Obviously, things didn't get this bad in the real world, and as far as I know, there's no bloodsuckers lurking in Pripyat. I've never been, but you know, I've heard. But the real Chernobyl incident was about as horrifyingly close to a full-on apocalyptic incident as we've ever come. Interestingly too, as a little Stalker tidbit, Stalker is very loosely inspired by a piece of classic Russian cinema. Unless you've got a Criterion Channel subscription, maybe you didn't know this, but the 1979 film Stalker, which is set in a hostile, strange environment where the laws of physics no longer apply, is led by scavengers who hunt through the strange land called the Zone. There's not a lot of post-apocalyptic mercenaries fighting zombies, and mostly it's just kind of esoteric musings. It's loosely inspired, but it's still very much worth noting if you're a big fan of grim dystopian European media, and if you like Stalker, you'll probably like the other Stalker. Moving on. Number 2, Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame was a series of survival horror games that put the player in control of various investigators in 1980s Japan, revolving around taking photos to find ghosts, plain and simple. The games are downright horrifying, with the developer's original intended mission statement being to make the scariest game possible, and there's quite a few fans who would agree with that. Although there's been a bunch of Fatal Frame games, the one we're going to be taking a look at is the very first. The first game in the series was largely inspired by a real Japanese urban legend ghost story, The Legend of Himuro Mansion. The story goes that a long time ago, a family lived in Himuro Mansion who participated in a strange ritual called the Strangling Ritual, which would seal off bad energy from within the earth. The family would choose a maiden, isolate her from the rest of the world to not attach her to the earth at all, thinking that this was part of the ritual if she got too connected to the material world. On the day of the ritual, she was bound by ropes and attached to horses, and you honestly don't want to know what comes next. The last ritual performed by the family ran into a bit of a hitch when the maiden fell in love with a man who tried to save her, leading to the patriarch of the family raising his blade to the maiden, then on his own family, then himself. The story goes that if you take a photo of the Himuro Mansion, you're able to see a ghost in the frame, which is what directly inspired the main gameplay mechanic of Fatal Frame, taking photos of ghosts. Now, I wouldn't feel super right if I didn't mention the tagline that boasts that Fatal Frame is based on a true story was only ever included in the North American release of the game, not the Japanese or European ones. So either it is inspired by this urban legend, or that was just something they put on the box to sell a cool game. Either way, Fatal Frame rules, and that's really all there is to it. And number 1, Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil has always been one of my all-time favorite series, and Resident Evil Village was like a kiss from Capcom on the cheek as a longtime fan. It was like RE4 and RE7 had a beautiful baby. It's probably the most out there the series has ever got, trading out the usual zombies and tentacle monsters for fairy tale horrors, werewolves, ogres, and a very tall vampire who I'm pretty sure at least 50% of the audience already knows a lot about. But as fantastical as Resident Evil Village is, did you know how much of it was inspired on reality? Yeah, well, okay, somewhat. First and foremost, the infamous Castle Dimitrescu was directly inspired by a real castle in the Carpathians where the game is set, Castle Pelish. If you look at some comparison images, it is like the spitting image down to the layout of the interior of the castle. Make sure to check those drawers for red herbs and ammo if you're ever passing through. Well, what about the lady of the manor, Miss Lady Dimitrescu herself? Well, tragically, there aren't any 9-foot tall vampire women, and if there are, call me. Art director Tomonoro Takano shed a bit of light on the inspiration for the very infamous lady. Her impressive stature is based on a Japanese urban legend called Hachisu Hakasama, an 8-foot tall woman with long black hair wearing a long white dress and a big brimmed hat. The Hachisu Hakasama lures men away by imitating the voices of their loved ones. While Dimitrescu never lures Ethan away this way, she does hold his baby hostage, so she's got the holding your loved ones thing down pat. But this urban legend wasn't the only inspiration for the lady of the manor. Dimitrescu is inspired directly by Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess of infamous renown, who was thought to be an occultist, a vampire, a demon, or something evil. Bathory was legendarily cruel, and would take great pleasure in the pain she inflicted on her victims. She allegedly would bathe in blood from the peasant girls she'd abducted, and would bite them and subject them to unbelievable cruelty. Lady Dimitrescu's castle features a massive bathtub of blood directly inspired by this legend, not to mention the medieval torture cellar she keeps down below in the basement. Lady Bathory never had claws or a second form in her boss fight, but she was undeniably one of the scariest women to ever live. And sometimes the truth is way scarier than the fictions.